We reached the old country estate in the early afternoon. This place brimmed with memories from my childhood, infused with the fragrance of wildflowers mingling with the earthy scent of age-old oak trees. My parents decided we needed a family getaway, a respite from the hustle and bustle of city life. Ultimately, it was just Ethan and me who made the trip. From the moment we stepped out of the car, I sensed a peculiar tension in the air. There was an unease that I couldn't quite identify. Ethan and I had always shared a close bond. As kids, we were inseparable, partners in mischief and best friends. Yet today, something felt off. He appeared distant, though his glances were more frequent, lingering just a bit too long. I tried to dismiss my feelings, telling myself it was nothing. But deep down, I understood otherwise. A subtle shift had occurred in our relationship, something we both were hesitant to confront. While unpacking, I stumbled upon an old diary that belonged to my mother tucked away in one of the drawers. It had been years since I last saw it. The pages were worn, and the handwriting had faded. However, the tales she penned about her youth captivated me. She wrote about a forbidden love, a secret that altered everything. The more I read, the more I felt as if I was looking into a mirror, seeing my own inner struggles reflected back. When Ethan entered the room, I quickly shut the diary, a wave of guilt washing over me, though I couldn't quite explain why. He regarded me with that familiar, inquisitive look, the one that always made me feel as if he could see right through my thoughts. "What are you hiding?" he teased, a playful smile on his face. "Nothing," I replied too hastily, my cheeks flushing. "Just an old diary. Mom's, nothing significant." He raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced, but he let it slide. "You are always the curious one," he remarked softly, almost fondly, before he turned to leave. His words lingered in the air long after he had exited, wrapping around me like a warm yet stifling blanket. Later that evening, we sat on the porch together, the cool air filled with the sound of chirping crickets. We discussed trivial matters, the weather, our jobs, and city life. We avoided the weighty topic that pressed on us both. I felt his knee brush against mine a bit too intentionally, causing my heart to race. I quickly shifted away, trying to laugh it off, but the tension only intensified. I told myself it was nothing, just fatigue, but the closeness of the house and the ghosts of our past seemed to play tricks on us. As the sun sank below the horizon, casting shadows across the yard, I felt his gaze on me, heavy and questioning. "Do you remember that summer we spent here? Just the two of us?" he suddenly asked, his voice low. I nodded, the memory rushing back. Of course, we were kids back then. Everything felt simpler. He smiled, but I noticed a hint of sadness in his eyes. "Yeah, simpler." There was a pause, and I could sense unspoken words lingering between us. "What's on your mind, Ethan?" I asked, striving to keep my voice steady. He looked deeply into my eyes. "I don't know. It just feels like something has shifted between us." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "What do you mean?" I asked, although I knew exactly what he was alluding to. I felt it too, the air thick with an unnameable charge, something that both thrilled and frightened me. Ethan hesitated, then reached out, his fingers brushing mine gently. "Maybe it's just this place," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Or perhaps it's something else." I instinctively pulled my hand back too quickly and stood up. "I think it's just been a long day," I said, my voice slightly trembling. "We should try to get some rest." He nodded, but his eyes remained locked on mine. "Yeah, maybe you're right." As I walked inside, my heart raced in my chest while climbing the stairs to my room. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was on the brink of something perilous, something I wasn't sure I wanted to confront. That night, lying in bed, sleep eluded me. My thoughts kept returning to how Ethan had looked at me, how his hand had felt against mine. I knew I should push these thoughts away, distract myself with something else. Yet, the more I tried, the stronger they became. Suddenly, there was a knock at my door. I sat up, my breath catching in my throat. "Yes," I called out, attempting to sound composed. The door creaked open, revealing Ethan, his figure silhouetted by the soft light of the hallway. "I couldn't sleep," he said simply. "Can we talk?" I nodded, my heart racing as I shifted over to make space for him on the bed. He settled next to me, so close that I could feel the warmth radiating from him. For a brief moment, we sat in silence, the weight of it thickening with every second. Finally, he turned to me, his face inches from mine. "I can't stop thinking about you," he whispered, his voice tinged with an emotion I couldn't quite identify. "I don't know what's happening between us, but I can't ignore that it's real." My breath hitched, my heart pounding in my chest. Part of me wanted to push him away, to tell him to leave and forget whatever this was. But instead, I found myself leaning closer, irresistibly drawn to him in a way I couldn't explain. And then, without warning, our lips met in a brief, tentative kiss that felt like it lingered for an eternity. When we pulled apart, I sensed the world shifting beneath me. Everything I thought I understood suddenly felt uncertain. "I'm sorry," he murmured, but his eyes conveyed a different story, one of desire and confusion, mirroring my own longing. I wanted to say something that would make sense of it all, but the words wouldn't come. All I realized was that something had changed, something irrevocable. As I lay back down, the taste of his lips still lingering, I understood I was stepping into uncharted territory, a realm from which I might not return. The following morning, the tension between Ethan and me was undeniable. We moved around each other with caution, as though the very air had thickened overnight, making it hard to breathe. I kept my gaze lowered, concentrating on mundane tasks to keep my hands busy, hoping to distract myself from the whirlwind of thoughts racing in my mind. Yet, forgetting the kiss was impossible. I couldn't stop replaying how soft and tentative his lips had felt, the way he had whispered my name with an urgency I had never experienced before. I kept telling myself it was just a fleeting moment, a mistake that would fade away if we both acted as though it never occurred. But deep down, I understood it was much more than that. Much, much more. We spent the day assisting our parents with the house, painting the old wooden fence and trimming the overgrown bushes surrounding the property. Occasionally, I would catch Ethan's eyes on me from the corner of my vision, his gaze intense and unreadable. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the tasks at hand, but my hands trembled and my thoughts scattered. During lunch, our parents chatted happily, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. I forced myself to join their conversation, smiling and laughing at their jokes. Yet inside, I felt like I was falling apart every time Ethan's hand brushed against mine while we passed the plates around the table. A surge of electricity coursed through me, causing my heart to race. After lunch, I felt the need to clear my mind. I announced I was going for a walk, hoping the fresh air would help me think clearly as I headed toward the woods at the edge of the property. I soon heard footsteps behind me and turned to see Ethan following. "I just need some space," I said quickly, feeling my pulse quicken. "I know," he replied, his voice steady, but his eyes were intense. "So do I. Let's walk together. It'll seem less suspicious." I hesitated for a moment, but eventually nodded. It was a reasonable excuse, and besides, I wasn't sure I could trust myself to be alone with my thoughts. We walked in silence for a while, the only sounds being the crunching leaves beneath our feet and the distant calls of birds in the trees. Ethan's presence beside me felt like a steady force, drawing me closer with each step. Eventually, we arrived at a small clearing where an old stone bench sat, half hidden by tall grass. We stopped, and I turned to face him, unsure of what to say. Sunlight filtered through the leaves above, casting dappled shadows across his face. For a moment, he simply stared at me, and I could see the conflict in his eyes, the same turmoil I felt about last night. I began to speak, but he interrupted. "Do you regret it?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. There was a vulnerability in his tone that I had never encountered before, and it made my heart ache. I opened my mouth to say yes, to claim it was a mistake and that we should forget it ever happened. But the words got stuck in my throat. Instead, I found myself shaking my head slowly. "No, I don't think I do," I admitted, feeling a rush of both guilt and relief. His expression softened, and he stepped closer. "Neither do I," he murmured, and before I could respond, he leaned in and kissed me again. This kiss was different, deeper, more urgent. I felt his hands on my waist, pulling me closer, and I melted into him, my body responding to his touch in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. For that moment, everything else faded away. My parents, the house, the consequences. There was only Ethan, his lips on mine, and his heartbeat echoing in my ears. I kissed him back, pouring all the confusion and longing that had been building inside me into that moment. It felt like jumping off a cliff into the unknown, exhilarating and terrifying at once. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathless, our faces mere inches apart. "What are we doing?" I whispered, my voice quivering. Ethan looked into my eyes, dark and serious. "I don't know," he replied, "but I can't stop."
Can you?
I shook my head, tears stinging my eyes. "No, I can't." We stood there in the clearing, caught between what we knew was right and what felt unavoidable. I wanted to run, to hide, to pretend that nothing had changed. But deep down, I understood it was too late. Something had already shifted, and there was no turning back. "I don't know how to deal with this," I confessed.
I'm scared, Ethan.
He reached up and gently wiped a tear from my cheek. "I'm scared too," he admitted softly, "but I don't want to pretend anymore." I nodded, fully aware he was right. Pretending wasn't an option, not anymore. As we walked back to the house, I felt an odd mix of dread and anticipation. I knew that things would never return to how they once were, that we had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Yet, deep inside, a small voice whispered that perhaps this was the start of something I had been seeking all along. The following days felt like walking on a razor's edge. Every glance exchanged between Ethan and me carried a weight neither of us knew how to bear. I could feel my parents' eyes on us, their puzzled expressions whenever we stumbled over our words or avoided each other in a way that felt just a bit too obvious. The tension hung in the air like a thick fog, and I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was beginning to spiral out of control. I tried to maintain some sense of normalcy, going through the motions, helping in the garden, preparing meals, and reading the diary during secret moments when I could be alone. But each word from that old journal seemed to mock me, reminding me of the parallels between my mother's hidden past and the forbidden feelings I was grappling with. One afternoon, while slicing vegetables in the kitchen, I overheard my mother's low, serious voice drifting in from the porch. I paused, my hands trembling slightly as I strained to hear. "Something is different with them," she was saying. "Have you noticed how they're behaving?" My father's voice was calm but firm. "I've noticed," he replied. "But they're adults now. Maybe we're just imagining things." My heart raced in my chest as a surge of panic washed over me, and I quickly turned back to my task, my mind racing. I was acutely aware that my parents were talking about us, Ethan and me. Their growing suspicions felt like a storm gathering strength on the horizon, and I realized with a sinking sensation that it was only a matter of time before they demanded explanations. I needed to have a conversation with Ethan to decide what we were going to do. That evening, I discovered him sitting alone in the garden, his face bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. I hesitated for a moment, gathering my courage before approaching him. "Ethan," I said softly, "we need to talk." He glanced up, worry etched on his tired features. "I know," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can sense it too. They're starting to catch on." I took a seat beside him, careful not to let our bodies touch, though I could feel the familiar pull between us, like an invisible thread drawing me closer. "What are we going to do?" I asked, my voice quivering. "We can't continue like this. They're going to find out." Ethan nodded slowly, deep in thought. "I've been contemplating it all day," he admitted. "Maybe it's time we create some distance between us. At least until we understand what this is." His words hit me hard, even though I knew he was right. Distance. I echoed, my voice wavering. "How do we manage that when we're stuck under the same roof?" "I don't know," he said, a hint of desperation creeping into his tone. "But we have to try. For their sake, if nothing else." Tears threatened to spill from my eyes, but I fought them back. Okay, I agreed, though reluctantly. But it's going to be really difficult. He reached out, his hand hovering near mine, and for a moment, I thought he would touch me. Instead, he withdrew, his face set with determination. We have to do this, Lily, he said firmly. We have no choice. I nodded, swallowing hard. You're right, I whispered. We have to. In the following days, we did our best to respect the distance we had promised each other. Our conversations were minimal, only when absolutely necessary, and even then, our words were clipped and formal, almost as if we were strangers. This silence only served to heighten the tension, amplifying the feelings we were both struggling to bury. One evening, as I assisted my mother in setting the dinner table, she studied me with concern. Are you feeling okay, Lily? She asked. You've seemed a bit off lately. I forced a smile, hoping it would appear genuine.
Ai fine, mom, I lead.
Just a bit tired. She nodded, though I could tell she remained unconvinced. If you need to talk about anything, you know I'm here, right? I nodded, trying to swallow the lump forming in my throat. Of course, Mom. Thank you. As we settled down for dinner, I could feel Ethan's gaze on me from across the table. I kept my eyes focused on my plate, unwilling to look up, yet his presence felt like a weight, making it difficult to breathe. After dinner, I decided I needed to escape the house and clear my head. I informed my parents I was going for a walk and headed toward the woods, hoping the fresh air would help me think clearly. As I walked along the path, I heard footsteps behind me and turned to find Ethan following. I thought we agreed to keep our distance, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. He hesitated for a moment before responding. I know, but I had to see you. I needed to talk. I sighed, too exhausted to argue.
Fine.
Let's talk, I replied, my heart racing. We walked in silence for a few moments until we reached a small clearing with an old stone bench. I turned to face him, my arms crossed defensively. What's going on, Ethan? He looked conflicted. I can't keep doing this, he finally admitted. I can't pretend everything is okay when I feel what I feel. My heart sank at his words. What do you want me to say? I whispered. I'm just as confused as you are. He stepped closer, searching my eyes. I don't know, he said, but I can't endure this distance between us any longer. It's suffocating. Before I could respond, he reached out and pulled me into a sudden, fervent kiss. It took me by surprise, and for a brief moment I hesitated. But then I felt the familiar warmth of his lips against mine, and I surrendered, wrapping my arms around his neck. This kiss was different from the last. There was no hesitation or uncertainty. It was passionate, filled with longing and fear, as if we were both clinging to each other for survival. I felt his hands grasp my waist, drawing me closer, and I realized we were crossing a line that we could never uncross. When we finally pulled away, we were both breathing heavily, our faces flushed. What are we doing? I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. Ethan shook his head, his eyes filled with anguish. I don't know, he admitted, but I don't want this to end. Tears welled up in my eyes, and a deep, aching sadness washed over me.
Neither do I confessed.
But what about them? What about Mom and Dad? He looked down, pained. I don't have an answer, he said. I just know I can't bear the thought of losing you. I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words settle over me like a heavy blanket. We need to figure this out, I finally said, before it's too late. He nodded, and for a moment, we stood there holding on to each other, fully aware that whatever happened next, our lives would never be the same. The days that followed blurred into a haze of stolen glances and whispered confessions. Ethan and I tried to maintain the facade that nothing had changed, but the tension between us was impossible to ignore. Every room felt increasingly confining, as if the walls were closing in on us. Each conversation became strained, and even the most casual touches sparked a tension that was hard to ignore. The distance we had tried to maintain had crumbled, replaced by a silent acknowledgement that we were in deeper than we had intended. I felt as though I was leading two separate lives, one in front of my parents, where I played the role of the obedient daughter, dutifully helping around the house and sharing laughs over their jokes, and another in the intimate moments with Ethan, where we were alone together. The atmosphere between us was thick with unspoken words. One evening, as the sun began to set, we found ourselves in the old barn at the edge of the property, a place once filled with laughter and childhood games. It had transformed, though. Now it felt charged with anticipation, as if even the walls were waiting to witness our next move. Ethan stood near the entrance, his back to me, tense and rigid. I could sense his internal struggle mirroring my own. "We can't keep this up," I said softly, breaking the heavy silence. "We're bound to get caught." He turned to face me, his eyes dark and frustrated. "I know," he admitted, "but I don't know how to stop." I stepped closer, my heart racing. "We need to come up with a plan," I insisted. "This lying and sneaking around isn't fair to anyone." He sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair. "I don't want to hurt them," he said, guilt heavy in his voice. "But I can't imagine losing you either." A tear slipped down my cheek, and I quickly brushed it away. "I don't want to lose you either," I confessed. "But what options do we have?" For a moment, we stood there, eyes locked, the weight of our reality pressing down on us. Then, without warning, Ethan closed the gap and enveloped me in a tight embrace. I could feel his heartbeat, rapid and uneven, echoing my own fear. "I'm lost on what to do," he whispered, his voice shaky. "I've never felt this way before." I held him close, seeking comfort. "Neither have I murmured. "But I'm scared, Ethan. Terrified." He pulled back just enough to look into my eyes. "We'll find a solution," he said softly. "We'll make it work." Before I could reply, he leaned in and kissed me. This time, there was no hesitation, no reservations. The kiss was slow and deep, brimming with emotion, as if he was trying to convey everything he felt through that connection. I kissed him back, my fingers tangling in his hair, losing myself in the moment. For an instant, all my worries, the fear, the guilt, the uncertainty, vanished. In that embrace, all I could feel was him, his warmth, his desire, his love. When we finally broke apart, I rested my forehead against his, both of us breathing heavily. "We need to be careful," I murmured. "We can't let anyone see us like this." He nodded, his expression solemn. "I know," he replied, "but I'm done hiding, Lily. I'm tired of pretending." I swallowed hard, a knot forming in my stomach. "But what if they find out?" I whispered. "What if they can't forgive us?" Ethan sighed, his eyes filled with anguish. "Then we face it head on," he said firmly. "Whatever comes next, we tackle it together." I nodded, trying to find solace in his words, but inside, I felt like I was teetering on a tightrope, caught between desire and ruin. I recognized the danger of what we were doing, that it could dismantle everything we had. Yet I also understood that I couldn't stop. The following day, things began to unravel rapidly. My mother started asking more direct questions, her gaze filled with suspicion. She caught me looking at Ethan several times, and I could see her mind working overtime to piece together the puzzle. "Is everything okay between you and Ethan?" she inquired one afternoon, her tone casual yet probing. I forced a smile, trying to sound nonchalant. "Of course, Mom," I replied. "Why wouldn't it be?" She hesitated, then shrugged. "I don't know. You just seem a bit off lately." I laughed lightly, trying to dismiss her concern. "I'm fine, really. Just a little tired." But it was clear she wasn't convinced. Later that evening, I overheard her speaking to my father in hushed tones. "Something isn't right with them," she said. "I can feel it." My father sighed. "Maybe you're overthinking it," he suggested, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. A wave of panic surged in my chest. I knew we were running out of time. If we didn't address this soon, everything would fall apart. That night, after my parents had gone to bed, I quietly slipped out to meet Ethan in the barn. My heart raced, and my palms grew clammy as I opened the heavy wooden door. He was already there, waiting for me, his expression tense. "They're starting to get suspicious," I said softly, my voice trembling. "I know," he replied. "We need to make a choice, Lily. We can't keep living like this.
Innåddet till sträckning 2 spill.
What do you think we should do? I asked, my voice shaky. He hesitated before saying, maybe it's time we come clean. My heart raced. Are you serious? I whispered, fear creeping in. He nodded. I don't see any other option. We can't keep lying to them. It's not fair. I swallowed hard, anxiety swirling in my mind. But what if they don't understand? What if they hate us? Ethan took my hand and squeezed it tightly. Then we'll face it together, he assured me. But we can't keep living this way, Lily. We need to be honest with them and with ourselves. I gazed into his eyes, searching for some reassurance that this was the right course of action. For a brief moment, I thought I saw it, a flicker of hope, a glimmer of certainty. Okay, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Let's do it. He pulled me into his arms, holding me tightly, and a rush of fear and relief surged through me. I realized that whatever happened next, we would face it together. Yet, as we stood there wrapped in each other's embrace, I couldn't shake the sense that we were teetering on the edge of something uncontrollable. That thought terrified me more than anything. The following morning, my nerves were frayed. I had hardly slept, tossing and turning as my mind raced with all the ways this could go wrong. Ethan had insisted that honesty was the only way forward. But as I stood in the kitchen preparing breakfast with trembling hands, I questioned whether I had the courage to follow through. Ethan entered the room, and our eyes met briefly. His face was calm, but the tension in his squared shoulders and clenched jaw betrayed him. He gave me a small nod, a silent promise that we were in this together. I nodded back, my heart pounding so loudly that I was certain he could hear it. Our parents joined us shortly after, and as we sat down at the table, it felt as if I were watching a scene unfold from a distance, like I was in a movie where the characters were about to embark on a life-altering moment. I could barely taste my food. My appetite had vanished, replaced by a tightening knot of anxiety in my stomach. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Ethan cleared his throat. Mom, Dad, he began, his voice steady yet firm. There's something Lily and I need to talk to you about. My mother paused with her fork halfway to her mouth, looking between us with a furrowed brow. What is it? She asked slowly, her eyes narrowing. My palms grew clammy, and my throat tightened. Ethan reached under the table, taking my hand in his and giving it a reassuring squeeze. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. We haven't been completely honest with you, Ethan continued, about what's been going on between us. My father's expression darkened. What do you mean? He asked, his tone laced with suspicion. I swallowed hard, summoning the courage to speak. We've grown closer, I said carefully, choosing my words with precision. Closer than we should have. My mother's face went pale, and she set her fork down with a sharp clink. What are you saying? She whispered, disbelief filling her voice. Ethan glanced at me before returning his gaze to our parents. We care about each other, he said slowly. But it's become more than that, and we realize it's wrong. There was a moment of stunned silence. I could see shock, confusion, and hurt written on their faces. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide, while my father's face flushed with anger. How could you? He finally shouted, slamming his hand down on the table. Your siblings. This is unacceptable. His words struck me like a slap, and I flinched. We know it's wrong. I quickly interjected, my voice pleading. We never intended for this to happen, but it did. And now we're lost. We don't know what to do. My mother shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. How could you let this happen? She asked, her voice breaking. We raised you both. We trusted you. Ethan raised his hands, his expression filled with regret. We didn't plan this, he said softly. We didn't mean to hurt anyone, but we couldn't keep lying to you. You deserve to know the truth. My father stood up, his expression hardening. I want you both out of this house, he declared. My breath caught in my throat. Dad, please, I begged, tears stinging my eyes. Don't do this. We're still your children. We made a mistake, but we're trying to make it right. His face softened slightly, but his voice remained cold. You made your choices, he said. Now you have to live with them. But not here. Not under my roof. My mother sobbed quietly, her head bowed. Mom, I whispered, reaching out, but she turned away, unable to look at me. Ethan stood and pulled me to my feet. We'll go, he said, his voice steady. If that's what you want, we'll leave. But we're not giving up on each other. My father's eyes blazed with fury. I don't want to hear it, he snapped. Just go. Get out of here. I felt numb as we walked out of the kitchen, my legs moving on autopilot. The reality of what we had just done, and what we had lost, began to sink in. Ethan's hand held mine tightly, grounding me, reminding me that at least we still had each other. We packed our bags in silence, the weight of our parents' anger and disappointment pressing down on us like a physical force. I could hear my mother crying softly in the other room, and my heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. As we stepped outside to the car, I cast a final glance back at the house, feeling a sharp pang of regret. This was my home, the place where I had grown up, where I had felt safe and loved. Now it felt like I was being ripped away from it, cast into the unknown. Ethan opened the car door and turned to me, his face set with determination. We'll figure this out, he said quietly. We'll make it work. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. I climbed into the car, and as we pulled away from the house, I watched it fade into the distance in the rearview mirror, a lump forming in my throat. We drove in silence for what felt like an eternity, the weight of our actions hanging heavily between us. Finally, Ethan reached over, taking my hand and squeezing it gently. I'm sorry, he said softly. I never wanted it to come to this. I looked at him, tears spilling down my cheeks. Neither did I whispered. But we'll make it through, right? He nodded, though uncertainty flickered in his eyes. We will, he promised. No matter what, we'll find a way. As we drove further away, I realized we were stepping into a future filled with uncertainty, one we would have to face together. Despite everything we had lost, a strange sense of hope flickered within me. A small light in the darkness. Because whatever happened next, I knew one thing for sure. We had chosen each other, and somehow, we would find a way to make that choice worthwhile.